Hello, friends. My name is Mark Moore. I'm the author of the book, Early Genesis, The Revealed Cosmology. I believe there is a link to its Amazon page in the description section of this video. BioLogos recently had a podcast about Adam with an all-star lineup of apologists, not all of whom saw things eye to eye with BioLogos as far as Adam and creation issues go. So they were inviting people in that had different viewpoints. They had someone from Reasons to Believe, A.J. Roberts. They had Ken Keathley from Stand to Reason, William Lane Craig, the noted philosopher. So it was a good lineup, and they had some good questions. But the view of Adam discussed in my book, which is the Christ-centered model, was not well represented in that discussion. The closest they got to it was an idea called representative Adam. What they mean by representative Adam and what I mean in the book, and certain others, by the way. I mean, there's the genealogical Adam and Eve by Joshua Swamidass. There's a fellow, a Brit across the pond, John Garvey, that has a new book that I think has just come out. We don't all say the exact same thing, but I don't want to give that impression. But we do say the same thing in the sense that Adam can be in the garden, divinely created, and they're representing Christ. He's a figure of Christ, as it says in Romans 5:14. He's the second Adam, as it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and there be the rest of humanity outside the garden. And so we have some differences when you go from there, but basically that's a two-population scenario, and it's where Adam is the federal head of humanity. I mean, he's the federal head of humanity, even if Adam and Eve are the only humans. After all, Eve took the fruit first, but it's said in Romans that through Adam, through one man, sin entered the world, and he was the man. Even though she had eaten the fruit first, sin did not enter the world through her, but through Adam. Why? He was the representative. He was the representative if there was two people or 1,000,002. But maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The closest thing they had to that idea, representative Adam, was something that William Lane Craig talked about, and he didn't think much of the idea. He gave 3 objections to representative Adam and Eve, and although I would not want to get into debate with William Lane Craig about philosophy, because he'd clean my chronometer, I just want to show the other side of the story. I want to talk about his answers, his 3 reasons why he didn't think representative Adam and Eve was correct, and show that, no, really, those don't really apply to the Christ-centered model. The Christ-centered model is a creationist version of representative Adam, and his objections to it don't actually apply. So let's listen to the first of William Lane Craig's, brilliant guy, great guy, first of his 3 reasons.
While that viewpoint is defensible scientifically, oddly enough, my reservations about it are biblical. I think there are 3 good reasons to think that Adam and Eve are not simply selected out of a wider population.
Here's William Lane Craig. His first reason points to the role of Genesis 1 through 11 as a whole, which is sometimes called the primeval history.
Scholars have asked themselves, why doesn't the book of Genesis begin with the call of Abraham in chapter 12, the origins of the nation of Israel? And the answer that commentators always give is that the primeval history is interested in universalizing God's concern for humanity. He's not concerned with just a select group of people. Rather, he is concerned with all of mankind. And therefore, the primordial history is prefixed to the call of Abraham to show that right from the beginning, God's concern with humanity is universal, and the call of Abraham is simply going to be the means by which God will fulfill his original intention to bless all of humanity. And so that universal interest is incompatible, I think, with this view that God has just selected 2 special people and their descendants to be the object of his concern.
Except that is not what Representative Adam says. Representative Adam is not saying that God is only concerned with the descendants of Adam and Eve. it's saying the same thing about Adam that the Bible is saying about Abraham and about Jesus, because again, 1 Corinthians 15 says Christ is the second Adam. Adam is the means by which God's plan to reconcile creation to himself is started, is initiated. There's a creation there. He worked in that creation. He made it better and better, but his work wasn't done. So he creates humankind and tasks them with the job of exercising dominion on his behalf, making the world a better place, knowing that they're going to fail at it without his continued intervention. And so Adam and Eve represent that continued intervention in the Christ-centered representative Adam model. So his objection might apply to some versions of representative Adam. It does not apply to the Christ-centered model. Instead, he's doing the exact same thing with Adam as he did with Noah, as he did with Abraham, as he did with Christ. He is selecting out specific persons, but not because he isn't concerned with the rest of the world, but because he is concerned, and he's providing a means of salvation for the rest of the world.
The second reason would be when you compare Genesis 2 and the creation of humanity to other ancient Near Eastern stories about how mankind was created, you find that this is a common interest in ancient Near Eastern mythology, stories about how mankind came to be. It's not about specific people, it's about how the human race was created by the gods and how they came to exist. And so Genesis would fit into that general interest. It gives a very different answer to the question. In the ancient Near Eastern myths, humanity is usually created as slave labor for the gods. But in the Bible, humanity is created as the image of God on earth, his special co-regents on this planet. And he loves us and calls us into relationship with him. But the interest is the same, explaining where humanity comes from, and that's a universal interest.
All right. I think William Lane Craig is right in that he says the other ancient Near Eastern accounts were about how all of humanity got here, not just two special people. But the Christ-centered model, I show from the scriptures, they're there. The others outside the garden, they're mentioned too. We just haven't seen it. They've been in the text all along. They've just sort of been read out of it because the detailed focus shifts so quickly to the means in chapter 2 by which God is going to initiate his plan to redeem everything that he created in chapter 1. So again, his argument does not apply to the Christ-centered model because and some of these folks that are talking about the two population scenarios like I have, they say the Bible is silent as to these people outside the garden. And William Lane Craig's objection applies to people who say that. But I'm not saying that the Bible is silent to those outside the garden. I'm saying it mentions them all along. We've just been missing what the text is actually saying. It doesn't go into great detail about them because you're talking about the creation of the whole universe in one small chapter, but it does mention them, and then they're sort of mentioned throughout. We've been missing it. So yes, early Genesis is like the ancient Near Eastern myths in that it is talking about the origin of all humanity, but it quickly shifts to God's personal intervention to redeem humanity and to fulfill his intent from Genesis 1:26 to make man in his own image. So his objection does not really apply here. He is correct that the Bible says something different about the purpose of man than the other ancient Near Eastern myths, which I believe appropriated the Genesis account and shifted it for political purposes. They wanted to justify the city-state where the persons were expected to labor hard all their life to support the system. And so they took God's original high purpose for man to be his viceroys on this earth. And then they've changed it to, oh, you were created by the gods to work hard. So work hard on behalf of our city state, and we'll stand in with God for you. And that was obviously a perversion of the original text and the original intent. But his objection does not apply to my two-population model. It might apply to others.
Factor would be the story itself, when you read it, suggests that there isn't anybody else on earth at that time. It begins in Genesis 2, when there was as yet no man to till the soil. Then God created Adam to work the ground. And there just doesn't seem to be anybody else on earth until he creates Adam, and there is no companion found for Adam on earth until Eve is specially created. So for those three reasons, I think that despite the scientific defensibility of this view, that it just doesn't fit with the biblical narratives.
While I would not want to cross swords on philosophy with William Lane Craig, on this one, I just have to say it does fit the narrative. People have just been misreading the narrative. They've been going into it with certain assumptions, and because they've been getting it wrong. They've been missing the point. And the point is the work of Christ. And people are not used to looking at that, even in the first chapter of Genesis, second chapter of Genesis. But if Jesus is right, he said in John 5:46, Moses wrote about me. So is that what the creation account is about? Yes, it is. But we haven't been looking at it that way. We've been arguing about lengths of days or evolution versus special creation, and we haven't been looking for the work of Christ. But it's in there, folks. And because it is in there, we see Adam more like a figure of Christ, where he comes into an already existing world that still, it is not, God still wants mankind to take it further and to go further with him. So I describe in other videos, I won't do so again here, but I've got one that says the Bible does not teach Adam was the first man, one that compares Genesis 2:1 with Acts 17:46. I invite you to look at those videos. Or if you're a glutton for punishment, read my 400-page tome where I describe in excruciating detail where those other people are in the text, where it is mentioning them. It isn't just about Adam and Eve. Now, he is talking about Genesis 2, verses 5 and 6, where he says, it says there was no man to till the soil up until that point, and so he created Adam. Well, I don't agree with Cyrus Scofield on everything, but Cyrus Scofield talked about verses 4, 5, and 6 being a bridge to the second account, or rather a summary of the first account. Secondarily, perhaps a bridge to the first account, but he talked about this is describing what the earth was like in summary of chapter 1. It wasn't talking about this is what things were like the day before Adam was created. It was saying this is what the earth was like before God started his real interventions. In other words, William Lane Craig says, it says there was no man to till the ground. Yeah, but it also says there was no shrub of the field. It also doesn't mention anything about animals. It also says there was no rain, but yet the surface of the earth was wet. There was no dry land. In other words, it's describing what things were like in chapter 1. It was summarizing. So in summary, here's what the earth looked like before God started intervening. There was no dry land. There was no shrubs and plants. There was no animals mentioned. And there was no man to till the ground. It isn't saying that there was no man right up until the time God created Adam, because otherwise you're missing out day 3 when the dry land appeared, day 3 when the plants were made, and even before that, day 2 when the water cycle was established. So it's not saying what he thinks it's saying. It's not saying that there's no man right up until the time he creates Adam. It's saying this is what things were like. In summary, before God started intervening, this is what things were like. Cyrus Schofield and I, we don't agree on everything, but we agree on that. And the other thing he mentions is, well, there was no helper found for Adam. Now, he's taking this to mean there were no other women in the world. But look at the animals. Look what happened with the animals. In chapter 2, everything is, that's whatever happened in chapter 1, that's straight up special creation in chapter 2. God forms the animals. Now, in chapter 1, it says the animals were formed before man, or the animals were made before man. In chapter 2, it says that the man was made first, and then the animals were formed to see as helpers or in search of a helper. So it seems like a conflict, and because it does, some versions try to fiddle with the language in chapter 2 to make it unclear as to whether the animals were formed before or after the man. And I describe why in my book in great detail, but the best translation is that in chapter 2, the animals are formed, the animals in the garden. This is not the animals in the whole world, but the animals in the garden are formed after the man is formed. They're formed to see if they can help him. And it's not every type of animal in the world formed either. It's the kind that would help with an agrarian and animal pastoral lifestyle. It's animals of the field, not animals of the whole earth. It's to help Adam build civilization, basically. So they were helpers. I mean, God was kind of pulling his leg, making the animals, and really what Adam wanted was a wife, and he kind of pulled his leg and gave him all these other animals, but they were helpers too. And you miss the humor if you don't get into it at that level. But my point is this. He can't justly say there was no men and women before Adam and Eve because God specially created Eve afterwards as if there was no other helper. Because the same thing happened with the animals. And we know from chapter 1 there were animals created before the people. So this is a special creation to help Adam accomplish his mission. That was the reason. That's why he just can't pick any wild animal that had been made wilder by the way man to that point had mishandled things. Why he couldn't just pick any wild woman. In addition to that, think of the real point of the story. The real point of the story is the seed of the woman. The real point of the story is that Messiah is coming. He's going to crush the serpent's head. He's going to fix all this. And the reason God outlawed Satan on this issue, God had ordained it would be through Adam that the world would be redeemed. And Adam blew it. But before he did, God took of his own flesh and made the woman. So it was still of Adam. And then when the seed of the woman bears Messiah, God's original intent is fulfilled. That would not have worked if God had picked some wild woman from the hills for Adam. He had to have a helper, not just a helper, but a helper suitable for him. And given what we now know from the New Testament, what God had in mind with Adam and Eve, the only suitable helper would be one from Adam. The church, just as the church flows from the wound in Christ's side, so Eve had to come from Christ. It had to be a picture of Christ in the church. It had to be Adam reclaiming what was his, not an outside conquest. The story of the gospel just doesn't work. And even though Fox sophisticates hate this, it's about the gospel. Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 is about the gospel. And the faithless may say, no, that can't be. No, it has to be confined to the meaning and intent of the original author. The original author is the Holy Spirit. That's who the original author is. And creation itself, you can't put human limitations on something that's divinely inspired. That's just a foolish attempt to try to impose methodological naturalism on the interpretation of Scripture. And while that might be okay in a chemistry experiment, it's a presumption of lawlessness and faithlessness and unbelief in the study of Scriptures, and it just sort of ruins the whole thing. So I dismiss it as silly because it's an idea that deserves to be dismissed. I'm not going to get into that now, but and William Lane Craig doesn't do that. But he does say some things about Representative Adam that I thought you should know the other side about. Great guy that he is. He may be thinking about a type of Representative Adam that is a little bit different than the Christ-centered model. So thank you for listening. If you're a glutton for punishment, please consider getting the book, and may God bless you.